Okay, good morning. Thanks for coming to our second day of the workshop on building pluralistic and inclusive states post-Arab Spring. This morning we're going to start off with an introduction by Dr. Mitri, the director of the Issam Fares Institute, and we will have the keynote address of the day by Dr. Matar after Dr. Mitri. And then we will continue with our first panel of the day. So I want to introduce Dr. Mitri. Dr. Mitri is the director of the Institute of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, a position he's held since 2014. He's the former special representative of the United Nations General Secretary in Libya. Dr. Mitri has served in 4 different governments as Lebanon's Minister of Information, of the Environment, of Administrative Development and Culture, and as acting foreign minister. He is also a member of the Strategic Board of Lebanon's University St. Joseph, this chair of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Palestine Studies, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He has lectured at a number of universities in Lebanon, Europe, and North America, such as University of Geneva, Harvard, and AUB. Dr. Mitri has extensive experience promoting Christian-Muslim relations and has published on the topic. So this is a very good opportunity for us to benefit from his scholarly and personal experience. Please welcome Dr. Mitri.
Thank you very much. I should have been here yesterday morning to welcome you all in this auditorium. I hope it's not too cold here. We're very pleased that your deliberations went well yesterday. I couldn't be here. I was away, arrived last night. Much of what you've been talking about, I believe, has been with us for a good number of years. Here at the Institute, we started a process of reflection and research on issues of transition, as they like to call it in the United Nations, and particularly on issues of inclusion in a fragmented Arab world. We started in the year 2000 and early 2016 with a major conference on the Arab uprisings, and much to our surprise, a pleasant surprise, there were a number of young scholars, mostly from Arab North Africa, that had joined us in trying to it was premature, probably, to analyze why is it that the promises of the Arab uprising were not kept. But that process of discussion went on for years. We've organized a couple of conferences with Princeton, and there's not a single month that passes without our institute organizing a panel, a lecture, or a small conference on what lessons need to be drawn, whether this is possible to draw lessons from what has happened, whether it is possible less than 7 years since those Arab uprisings to make a proper evaluation. It is often said that Xu Enlai, who had knowledge of the history of France, when asked to give an opinion about the French Revolution, said that it was too early to make a judgment on the French Revolution. So I'm one of those who think that it is still too early to make statements about the so-called failure of Arab uprisings. the few notes I'll share with you are primarily draw on those discussions we've had here, but also some of them draw on my own experience and reflection. I will be very short. I think overstating failures is the other side of what was an exaggerated enthusiasm that was evoked by the use of the metaphor of the Arab Spring. Such use brought to memory many short-living springs. In our region, Damascus Spring, in Eastern Europe, the Prague Spring, and 19th century Europe, in the 1848 Spring. But their closure seemed to overshadow that all these springs had a long-lasting effect. And people speak about their failure, less about their long-lasting effects. Disillusionment, uncertainty, and fear notwithstanding, the yearning for dignity, freedom, political participation, which motivated revolutions against patrimonial authoritarian regimes, could not be dismissed as ephemeral. The broad-based social demand for democracy, no matter how vaguely defined is democracy in the Arab world, is often ignored by those who precipitously opt for a culturalist explanation of our difficulty to transition towards a democratic polity and society. Precarious national structures and the related fragility of national cohesion, exacerbated further by the rapid and unanticipated collapse of the old order, favor the tendency in our part of the world to overemphasize the strength of primordial ties in comparison with the civic ties that are constitutive of a modern democratic polity and society. One could not ignore the resurgence, I'd rather say the reinvention of sub-national identities and the centrifugal forces at work in many Arab countries. Many members of communities, not only minority communities, religious or ethnic, seem to have lost their aspiration to a state for all. And they seem to beg for a power structure that can protect them, sometimes from another community. Political and electoral strategies of mobilization have accentuated communalism and encouraged the surfacing of narratives of victimhood. And it's amazing how much competition for victimhood, if I may, there is in the region. You just go to Iraq, to mention one country, and members of different communities look at themselves, perceive themselves to be victims. And the narrative of victimhood is, to be sure, emotional, but can be equally aggressive. Ethnic groups and ethnicized religious groups are both actors and victims of identity politics. Throughout the 20th century, their members struggled to assert themselves and be recognized as citizens. But many of them retreated into minority-centered, enclaved when possible, communities. And the very conflicts that undermined what is left of the state, became for many rulers of the region a source of legitimacy, a cause for further entrenching and distraction from addressing problems that those rulers were neither capable nor willing to solve, such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. It is therefore not a surprise to see violence becoming a policy by default. Transition from authoritarian regimes, whether patrimonial or not, to democracy has proved to be more arduous than anticipated. Today, the social demand for security and stability in a context of a bloody disorder is interpreted in some countries, such as in Egypt, as a demand for return to an authoritarian rule. But it is not. For repression is far less tolerated than before, and the call for political participation could not be silenced. The legacy of authoritarian regimes, I worked in Libya, weighs heavily. One cannot understress how it weighed heavily on political conduct of both old and emerging elites, and the management of transition, nurturing suspicions and mutual fears. Rebuilding state institutions that were left in desolation was severely hindered. To be sure, the shortfalls of transition could not be overstated. The deficit in competence and experience of large segments of the new political elites, the weakness of political forces with a social base that is attached to democratic values or aspiring to a democratic order, all of those may explain the volatility of state building. Progress on the arduous road towards democratic transformation could not be achieved by adopting a presumably universal model of transition. A paradigm for social change and political change has to be better suited to the realities of today, not the lingering hope of an earlier era. Precipitation in moving forward did not adequately recognize the strength of subnational identity assertion, nor those of our cultural resistance, if I may, to new norms of political practice. Not enough time was given in our part of the world to the first but crucial phase of transition, which is supposed to establish rules for public life accepted by all and ensuring the widest political participation, underlining inclusivity as an energizing principle. Such principle is the principle of inclusivity is considered to be costly for those who are in power, but also by some who oppose them, especially when there are those who claim they are representing majorities. Majorities represented in this manner refrain from reaching out to the fearful minorities. I'm not talking only about religious and ethnic minorities, about political minorities as well, who always fear being excluded. And their inability to include has undoubtedly contributed to the radicalization of the excluded. But times of uncertainty and fear are also times of change. The tension of turning victims into actors may not be resolved in the near future. Recognizing the present fragmentation and communalization is inevitable, but designing political systems that mirror them assumes that they are never changing realities. Voices that seem to be suppressed today would not be voices silenced forever. In the midst of chaos and destruction, the emergence of forces striving towards citizenship and national unity may become, rather than an impossible dream, a principle of hope. It's good to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitri. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Khawla Matar. Dr. Matar is the Deputy Executive Secretary for Program Support for the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Prior to her appointment in this position, she was the Director of the Office of the Special Envoy for Syria in Damascus. Before that, she was the Director of the United Nations Center in Cairo, which covers the entire Arab region. During the same period, she was asked to serve as the spokesperson for the then Special Envoy for Syria, Ambassador Dr. Ibrahimi. Before joining the United Nations office in Cairo, she served with the International Labour Organization as the Regional Officer for Basic Rights at Work and as Regional Information Officer. She worked at different regional and international organizations such as the Arab Center for Childhood and Development. Dr. Matar has extensive experience in journalism in addition. Lastly, she served as the editor-in-chief of Al-Waqt Daily. Dr. Matar holds a PhD in sociology of the media from Durham University in the UK. Please welcome Dr. Matar.
Thank you. Sabah al-khair. Good morning. I'm really honored to be with you today, and I'm even more honored to speak in front of my mentor, Sil Akhdar Ibrahimi. And it's not an easy thing. When I saw my name, I felt that it's a challenge. And speaking after Dr. Tariq Mitri is another challenge. But I think that this region, more than any period in its history, is confronted by huge challenges. Much of it has been discussed yesterday and today. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to attend and participate in the discussion and deliberations of yesterday, but part of it in the morning. While walking yesterday, I was an AUB student long time ago, before many of you were born. And I remember the milk bar. And the first thing that struck me as a young woman coming from a small island in the Gulf is that the debate among the youth in AUB, coming from all parts of the world, and they were all speaking about the future, talking about freedom, participation, democracy, liberation, and it felt so good to listen. At some point it turned violent and they started to beat each other, but it wasn't as violent as the violence we are witnessing right now. ESQA, the organization I'm representing today, is actually confronted with all of these challenges and has been asked not only to support the people of this region, the poor people of this region, the marginalized people of this region, the youth, the women who have aspired a lot in 2011, And that brings me also to fast forward 28th of January 2011. I'm entering Cairo coming from Tunisia, representing a team of UN who went to Tunisia to supervise and see the atrocities during the first Arab uprising. Not the first, the Arab Spring. Many people are still debating, is it a revolution? Was it a revolution? Is it an Arab Spring? And Ahmed, the man who was courageous enough to drive me through Cairo and the burning buildings all over the place, told me, the young people are burning these institutions that resembles, and for them, were institutions of torture, of marginalization, of abuse. And he said, for years, we've been marginalized and we've been abused. And as youth, we have no say in what is happening in our country. So while many regions around the world have enjoyed increased levels of peace and security, in recent decades, far too many people of this region are poorly supported with weak institutions or no institutions at all. And like Dr. Mitri was saying, the people of this region are now being told that you have a choice. Is it security and peace, or is it freedom, democracy, and participation? And that's what the media is playing, and something I would like to talk about because it's very close to my heart at the end, which is, in my opinion, a dangerous statement and a dangerous narrative to indulge in. The root causes of what is happening in this region is actually the main issue for ESCWA. And when ESCWA works around the issues of economic and social, we cannot shy away from saying, if we don't tackle the root causes, then we will never be able to overcome what is happening or having relapses of conflicts and wars. A considerable governance deficit coupled with the longest occupation in history, and we cannot forget that this region is doomed with the longest occupation of Palestine. Conflict and its spillover effects are among the most significant development challenges affecting the Arab region at present. And for generations to come, we are studying how much these conflicts and occupation is going to have an effect for generations to come. Over 140 million people live in conflict-affected areas and environments of varying intensity in this region, where wars are causing hundreds of thousands of casualties and long-term injuries. This is in addition to devastation of major urban centers that were the centers where we used to see little bit of diversity, peaceful coexistence, accepting of the other, culture, and trade. I was in Aleppo in December 2016, and I think that time we called you Sil Akhdar from there. And the war was, we were running among shelling everywhere. And Aleppo, that used to be a city of culture, peace, trade, you name it, and coexistence, was a devastated city under war. And when we spoke to the people, they said, we in the urban, rural areas of Aleppo have always been, we the poor have always been marginalized. There is a class division that is so huge and gap that has actually played a huge role in what is happening and increased it. With more than 30 million people pushed out of their homes, many of them are women and children alone, because the men in many of these countries were at the war front, on either side of the war front in many times, or had to run away because they were going to be pushed to fight anyway. The Arab region has the highest ratio of displaced population worldwide. Over 50 million people are dependent on humanitarian assistance between Syria And Yemen alone, more than 6 million children are out of school, a devastating fact for the region. When we talk about 6 million children, let alone talking about the other children in other countries that are not affected by conflict, but affected by children who cannot afford to go to school, the number increases a lot. And we have seen increase in number of working children at a very young age. The displacement itself, we've seen families that have been displaced within Syria, within Libya, within Yemen, and in Syria particularly with my personal experience, have been displaced 5, 6, 7 times. So that in itself is a big challenge, not only for ASCA, but for the whole UN community that have the major role in supporting the people of this region. Beyond its immediate and short-term disruptions, the conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Iraq, in addition to the Israeli occupation, have brought devastation, long-term devastation and consequences on states and societies in the region, with varying degrees of impact on human development, depending on factors such as age, gender, education, or health. Let alone all the other aspects and dimensions. At the UN Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, we are working closely to change it into the UN Economic and Social Commission for Arab States. We are studying these very issues. We're working on these very issues on a daily basis. We're looking at the long-term impact of conflict over development outcomes, and thereby better placing ourselves to define short and long-term priorities for this region, as well as specific regional interventions to help mitigate the long-term consequences of these wars and crises. We at ASCWA feel that without a regional approach to many of these issues, this region will find itself in a continuous conflicts and wars. The regional context has also forced us a more in-depth examination of the humanitarian, development, and peace-building nexuses. We feel that we are responsible not only to confront and help the people in crisis and war, but we are responsible for preventing more crisis and war in this region, and we are seeing signs of these. Where we attempt to answer the question on how to deploy much-needed humanitarian assistance, while at the same time catering to development priorities of the millions of people affected by conflict. This was a debate among UN agencies while developing humanitarian assistance. The question was, should we support what is left of states, institutions in these countries? And many times the political element comes in and says, you shouldn't, because these are institutions run by dictators, supported by dictators. Yet, the idea is that without these institutions, many of these institutions, the people of Syria, Yemen, Libya will not be able to survive. Because we've seen when the war destroys electricity, water supply, basic health institutions and education, with the support of the UN to specifically these institutions, and with the hard working of many of the people of these countries and the resilience of the people of these countries, then these people can survive and can persevere and maybe, hopefully, can be able to build new states. Also very much missing from the policy debate remains the regional approach to addressing spillover effects of conflict. The issue of forced displacement, for instance, is a regional problem that very much requires a regional solution. Many times we think that Syria, Yemen, and Libya is a conflict by itself, but the spillover has been not only affecting the region, but reaching Europe right now. the magnitude of the impact of conflict on affected population has been far surpassed any country's ability to address these overwhelming transnational challenges on its own. Conflict dynamics and impacts are no longer confined to national borders, as terrorism, hate speech, extremist religious discourse, non-state actors intervening across borders, illicit crime networks, large swathes of ungoverned spaces, and the increasing militarization of societies have become too common. Yesterday, I was reading an article about what is happening in Aden, and I've learned that the salaries given to young men who have been unemployed for years, most probably even before the crisis started, is almost like $500. It's a lot of money for a Yemeni living in the south, have been marginalized, unemployed, uneducated maybe for years. When we talk to many armed groups in Syria, the Tunisian guy who was the emir of Al-Qaryatain in Homs, was telling us, I was a nobody in Tunisia. I was in a village, marginalized, have no access to education or limited access, and no access to employment. So now I am the emir. It's not only the money, it's the effect of having the power and the control. He controls a city that was, Al-Qaryatain was a city that had coexisted between Christians and Muslims for years. When ISIS moved in, and with the Tunisian emir, he shifted most of the Muslims and gave them the option of either turning into Christians or being imprisoned. And of course, you know what happened to the women there. As the regional arm of the United Nations, ESCWA is therefore uniquely positioned to look at the root causes of these crises, wars, and mostly the root causes that has led to the collapse of many of the states and state institutions. With its convening capacity of the relevant regional actors to provide affected member states with sound analysis, policy advice, and capacity building. And I have to say, much of the times when we provide policy advice, no, we don't find listening ears. It's very few times that we have to hammer it and repeat it and showcase what is happening if that. So it's not an easy task. On the last point, we are very much focused on institutional development, engaging civil servants on issues such as displacement, reconciliation, institutional gaps assessment, methodologies, mitigating the impact of conflict on the life cycle of the people we serve. We also are trying to look into transitional justice. And we think without transitional justice in a regional context, much of the impact of these wars will not be able to go back to live together as societies that accept the other and share their old sources and resources. Supporting an effective regional approach requires a synergy with national challenges, particularly in relation to governance, something that we feel that is the core of the conflicts in the region. For this, we need to focus on identifying and analyzing the critical set of institutions and reforms required for countries to transition out of conflict into state building and stability. Analysis that focuses on identifying challenges and outlines the priority areas, as well as the sequencing of reforms that would help phase out conflict. In Syria, we're working very hard right now. We have produced scenarios for constitutions by Syrians. We produce scenarios for elections by Syrians. We produce scenarios for transitional period by more than 1,400 Syrian experts who have put these scenarios. It's not for ESCWA to implement them. It's for ESCWA to provide them to the Special Envoy and his team, the political dialogue and others. We've been reached by many during the past many days, in fact, from Sochi and other places, asking us for these scenarios. I don't know how helpful they will be, but I know that they were Syrian drafted, Syrian caused, Syrian accepted. These are the key prerequisites for driving progress in all sustainable development goals and promoting peace and security. One cannot last without the other, peace and security. At the same time, we need to address economic development challenges. Since the onset of the instability in 2011, the Arab Spring, yet a number of conflicts and wars happened, $483 billion have emerged as illegal financial flows. For every $1 the Arab region received in ODA, a correspondence, 90 cents, were channeled to other regions, and had remittances cost been reduced as mandated by Sustainable Development Goal number 10. The Arab region would have saved up to $8.3 billion worth of additional development finance. In December, this last December, ASQA launched a report on rethinking fiscal policy in the Arab region. It asked whether or not current fiscal policies are up to the task of the 2030 agenda, and yet the development of the countries of this region, in addition to countries that are going through wars and crisis. Not surprisingly, our report found that the answer is mostly no. Fiscal policies in the Arab region do not respond to development needs, at least not yet, to be more political. Many countries are still lagging in connecting fiscal policies and development aims, showing that our region urgently needs a course correction in terms of economic reforms. But the economic reforms that we are calling for are not the economic reforms that most of these countries are taking right now. The economic reforms that we are calling for is more of an inclusive, a state responsibility towards people, a providing of services. It's not the economic reforms that actually marginalizes a more larger portion of the population. If we want to see changes in the quality of governance, we need to go through serious economic reforms that are transparent, inclusive, and hear the voices of the people. Earlier this week, the UN Economic and Social Council, one of the main organs of the United Nations, held its annual Youth Forum, a venue for youth around the world to voice their opinions, share ideas, and think together about what they can do to achieve sustainable development. In the Arab region, as you all know, nearly 60% of the total population is under the age of 30. That's a great percentage of the population. Many of these, the majority of these, are unemployed or underemployed. When investment is strongly geared towards building young people's human capital and productivity, development and prosperity are the outcome. However, in the Arab region, decent human development for young people has not yet been achieved across the board, as evidenced by high unemployment rates, especially for women. Some Arab governments have started involving young people in policy making and addressing the urgent need for gender equality. Yet, this is not enough, and not enough voices are being heard. In fact, many of the young people are feeling more and more marginalized. It's the elitist young that have been able to reach the upper position within the societies and governments. It's not the majority of the young people. This is an encouraging step in the right direction as we continue to create channels for participation built on trust and full respect for the rights of young women and men. Trust is the name of the game in this region. The people of this region have lost trust in their governments, have lost trust in their institutions, have lost trust even in their political parties and sometimes even in civil society associations. So all of this is a huge challenge for an organization like ESQA to be able jointly with others to build with the participation of the people of this region. The people of this region are demanding greater voices and autonomy to shape their future through plurality and inclusiveness. I have to say a few words about, like I said before concluding, about how media and social and traditional media have played a role in the crisis and in dividing societies and marginalizing people more and more, playing the narrative of marginalization, of dividing the people. And I think in any endeavor to overcome all of this, the media and the religious institutions have to play a role because they were part of this whole crisis. I look forward to today's active debates, especially among many of tomorrow's young people, thought leaders. Thank you.